here we were, these two complete strangers, coming to meet each other at a time where our respective communities are in so much turmoil, are stuck in so much pain, so much trauma, and just this natural desire to want to be in conflict because there is so much of it in our psyche, right? Our collective psyche. And yet, immediately we could see through each other's worlds. We could see into each other's communities, into each other's communities' pain, and we could validate it without necessarily having to agree.
Welcome to Season 15 of Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand that the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. Thanks so much for watching. Enjoy the show. Welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today I am joined by Kawtar El Alaoui, who is a multi-award-winning consultant, coach, facilitator, and speaker. Her work supports conscious leaders and organizations, and she is the best-selling author of Unfolding Peace: 9 Leadership Principles to Create Cultures of Well-Being, Belonging, and Peace. I have so much to say about this book. I love this book. It should be on Oprah's hit list. Kawtar's work bridges whole brain leadership, purpose, and effective strategy while increasing well-being and flow within teams. Since November of 2023, she has been co-creating an experiment in radical empathy with David Sauvage, a teacher of emotional intelligence and founder of the nonprofit Culture of Healing. The experiment, which is called How We Make Peace, is a series of raw, unguarded, and embodied conversations between Kawtar, a Muslim Arab, and David, an American Jew, about the war in Gaza. The effect is to bring healing in real time to the pain so many of us are experiencing right now. Kawtar and David are also writing a book about all their learnings, and they love sharing their work in front of live audiences as they have been, and you can reach out to find more about their project at conscious-togetherness.com. Welcome to the show, Kawtar.
Thank you so much, Anita. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
I am like pins and needles, goosebumps, eyes already welling up with tears, excited about our conversation because I am so moved by the work that you and David are doing. He's been on my radar as somebody to speak to for a long time. I put my podcast on pause for 3 months just to find a little break in my pace. And when I discovered the new work that he's doing with you and watched the video that I will include in this video, I'll slice it in. I was just incredibly moved by what I thought was a powerful conversation with two people holding space for one another to share their truths, not try to change another person's opinions, but validate their experience, their what they're having on a somatic, spiritual, psychological level. And I witnessed that in real time happening for both of you. And I was skeptical going in, but I was just incredibly moved. And so I interviewed him, and when he introduced me to you, I was like, I've got to interview you as well. So I'm just so grateful to have you on the show.
Thank you, Anita. I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to share more about the work and to meet you.
Yes, and I promise to all of the listeners and viewers who are now hooked to the podcast, we will get back to this. Okay, I promise we will get back to this. This is the heart of the conversation, but I want to spend a little bit of time talking about your book. So when I knew we were going to be having this conversation, I ordered it, and the opening is your story, your personal story, and maybe you want to share some highlights. I don't want to summarize your story, so maybe tell us a little bit about what your journey was to start.
Yeah, thank you, Anita. It still feels vulnerable at times to go so much into the story, but I would say the crux of it, the essence of the story, is that at the core of the explorations of my life has been the question of how do we create violence? Why is there so much of it? And how do we get out of it? And that came in through personal experiences of at first growing up feeling very disconnected from myself and the world around me, of conflict being so normalized in my life, whether in my family life, as a child, or as a cultural norm. There were so many ways that conflict was normal and even expected to be perpetuated. And it didn't really make sense to me. It never made sense to me. And so, as an adult, and especially also as a woman, I often fought for my own identity. I often fought for my own empowerment. I often felt that I had no choice but to fight. And yet, my deepest longing was peace. And when I finally studied law and thought, okay, this is it, I have my pathway out, I'm going to create equality for myself, for others. And then, long story short, found myself in a very abusive, violent marriage, and with a very strong cross-cultural element in it. And the journey coming out of that had me really reflect deeply on some of my cultural baggage, but also some of my religious beliefs. I think one of the most powerful experiences was when I realized I was in that marriage because I was worried. I was scared of going to hell. And I went to see a religious authority in Islam, an imam. And I said to him, he says to me, "Why are you in this marriage?" And I said, "Well, I'm scared that if I leave, I'll go to hell." And he leans in and he says to me, "But my child, you are in hell. No, God will punish you for leaving." And it was such a pivotal moment for me, to start to look at what are these beliefs that I grew up with? Where did I even get this baggage, this belief that I would go to hell? I didn't grow up in a strongly, particularly religious family, and yet I had picked up the cultural beliefs. And then, working, starting my career as a young aspiring attorney, and being faced with systemic discrimination and with the biases against myself being Muslim, and what that meant for me, both in my personal life, living abroad and unable to come back, waiting for my husband to get his immigration papers, just post 9/11, of course, having no idea what was waiting for us when we left Canada. And then later living here and again being locked out of access to a position at the Department of Justice for the very same reason. And that again just got me so disillusioned with, the ideals of equality, the ideals of peace. And so it launched me on this post-traumatic stress disorder journey that I completely lost my health. And at some point I had to face the reality that I could no longer function. And I remember my therapist just telling me, like, this is it. You cannot go to work tomorrow. You literally cannot go to work tomorrow. And having to make that decision to stop, not knowing what that meant for my future. And, as a single parent and really worried about the future that lay ahead of me at 33 years old, being declared disabled, at 33 years old. And coming out with all that baggage, the questions that I had were, how did I get here? How did I get here? And how do I get out? And then as I started to unpack all of that for myself, I started to find the disempowering beliefs that we hold as societies, as human beings, that are embedded in our cultural narratives, and that essentially create this constant disconnection from ourselves and from each other. And so fast forward a decade later into my explorations that also led me to a career shift, beginning with mediation and later coaching and consulting. I also realized that these skills that we can develop that lead to well-being, that lead to this sense of connection and belonging, are actually the skills that lead to peace. And I found that link between the personal and the collective. And so it sort of became a natural mission for me to share this message and to share the skills, and also to kind of bridge the gap. I see my work as bridging the gap between where the peace building community's work stops and where the rest of the society starts. And I truly believe if we embed these skills into leadership and education, we will have a world without war. Maybe not in one generation, but we will have a world without war. It is truly possible.
I love that as a moonshot. I wish you Godspeed luck at making that happen, and I'm fully on board with you, ready to help however I can. I want to read from the book so that people will pick it up because I think it's such a powerful, like it's a template for so many things, the inner work that we need to do and the healing work. I mean, I was underlining across so many different paragraphs, and I'm sure I'm going to come back to this book on a regular basis. So you write, this is not a feel-good, easy to read, simple self-help book. It is a serious manual for a clearer, more contented, and more fruitful and impactful life. And if you want to change your life, it does demand inner work. Inner work demands planning, focus, application, patience, and determination. And then you have the reward of a more satisfying, calm, fulfilled, and beautiful life in service to your community and the planet. And it's a mic drop. This book delivers on that promise. I just want to let you know how really, really good this book is.
Thank you. That means a lot to me. I still have inner critics at times that like to wake up and tell me differently.
No, and you have 9 principles, and they're all relatable. We can all find ourselves in those principles, and then there's frameworks to help you, work through them. So, tell me what you hope readers will take away from the book, and maybe a little bit about your own journey in writing it.
Yeah, thank you. I think what I want readers to take away from the book is that authenticity works, right? Like we do not have to live disconnected from our lives. And that would be one of the main takeaways that I would hope readers do take away from it. And then just giving ourselves permission to be messy in this journey called life, to stop trying to do it perfectly. And not only trying to do it perfectly with ourselves, but also with each other. I think there is so much expectation on how we're supposed to be, all these masks that we're supposed to wear, and all these roles, and how perfect we're supposed to get it all the time. It's exhausting.
Yeah.
And it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think when we give ourselves that permission and we start to bring that into our relationships, it just literally changes and transforms the quality of our lives and the quality of the world that we live in.
Yeah. And I'm reflecting on a moment in time back in the early spring of 2020. So COVID was happening, but George Floyd had just been murdered too. I remember I was teaching online, and it was a small cohort, and I've done in my classes a few moments of silence when there have been other major tragedies. And school shootings or other calamities. And so we took a moment of silence, and I'm grateful to this young Black student who afterwards, took a few minutes with me and said, Anita, I know that your intention here was really good, and thank you. But I have spent the last few days, because it had happened just, I think, maybe 3 or 4 days earlier, in a heightened state of PTSD around, or I don't know if those are his words, but anyways, like a heightened sense of, agitation. And to come into a class and be reminded of that and then be expected to concentrate on the class, that's a heavy lift. And that took courage for him to say to me because of the power dynamics of our relationship. But I'm grateful too, because it really helped me recognize that, whatever well-meaning intention I had because my goal in this was to say we can't continue class without even mentioning it. We have to at least give space to it. But I also recognize the injury for him. So it's complicated because even when we were just doing a pre-call for a few minutes, you were telling me about how you met David, and you were saying that you were having conversations in your workplace, knowing that you were working with Jews. There were there's a multiplicity of cultures in our workplace. And then we go to work pretending as if like the layer of whatever geopolitical stuff is unfolding doesn't matter. So could you take us back to when you had those early conversations among colleagues and what happened there?
Yeah, absolutely. So on October 7th, when the events happened in Palestine and Israel, my first response was, again, a strong PTSD response. I got completely dysregulated. As a Muslim, the first response that often comes up is shame. The next response is often this deep seated fear, like that touches on terror inside of my body. And I knew the backlash is not going to be easy or simple for any one of us. And so it also took me about a week to come back from that dysregulated state. And I was working in a project with Jewish colleagues. And I've done a lot of identity work. And so generally, I have this ability to meet other identities, from a place of peace and ease and grace, giving grace to each other, as I say. And yet, every meeting we had, we all have these skills. We all know how to hold each other and ourselves, how to self regulate. And there was always this underlying tension. Nothing that was spoken, nothing that was projected on each other outwardly, but there was this underlying tension. And so, as I stayed with my own process and started to look at what is this traumatic response telling me, because I have learned that PTSD as a traumatic response, at least for me, is also a call to action. It's once I clear that response, there's a lesson of how to move from the traumatic past to a different and better future. And so once I got to that place, I wrote an article and I reached out to my friend Andy Swindler, who was my colleague at the True Purpose Institute as well at the time, at the Gathering of Change Agents. And I asked him to read it with me, to read my article. He had been to Israel and Palestine a few years ago, a couple of years ago. And so it just happened that the conversation sparked further and further with him. And so he read my article, just helping me nuance it, balance it. I was trying to hold all voices, all narratives, all perspectives with care, because that's what I believe in, right? And so from that conversation with Andy and the article that I published on my own blog at first and some of the feedback I received, it gave me the courage to say to my colleagues, I think we need to have a circle where we're just sitting with each other's experiences of this war outside of our work context. And I was honestly quite terrified to do that because, being the person having the PTSD response and yet the person responsible for holding the circle was a little terrifying. Anything could have gone wrong.
I
Anything and
even
everything.
feel in the pit of my stomach energy, like the, the bad butterflies when it's like contentious. I feel that just listening to you.
Absolutely, right? And when you're the space holder, and so, I was wondering, am I going to be able to hold my own? Am I going to be able to self regulate? And yet, just trusting in that intuition, I called the circle, and it was absolutely beautiful. All we did was we sat with each other, using our practices, our grounding practices, listening to each person, what their reality was, what their truth was, and, practicing the skills of radical empathy, as David and I have been doing. Um, and in that circle, at the end of that circle, is when the initiative started for Heal Together and, how we make peace. Because Andy got this intuition to bring David and I together as a result of that circle.
Hmm.
And so that's how he reached out to David. He reached out to me separately and brought us together. And David and I had never met before. It was the first time that we met, I think, was either late October or early November 2023. And it was such a validating moment for me, in a way, for everything that I've learned, for everything that I believe in, because here we were, these two complete strangers, coming to meet each other at a time where our respective communities are in so much turmoil, are stuck in so much pain, so much trauma, and just this natural desire to want to be in conflict because there is so much of it in our psyche, right? Our collective psyche. And yet, immediately, we could see through each other's worlds. We could see into each other's communities, into each other's communities' pain, and we could validate it without necessarily having to agree.
Mm.
And that was extremely powerful. And in a way, that's how the experiment started.
And I'm just about to share the 10-minute clip in this video. But before we do that, could you just unpack what you define as radical empathy? What does it mean to you?
Absolutely. So, to me, empathy is the ability to feel with someone, not feel for them, but really just feel with them to make sure that it's essentially like walking into someone's world, suspending my own judgments, suspending my own preconceived notions, and my own projections on who they should be, how they should process the world, and why I think I should be right in that. And so it's putting sort of a pause on all that and saying, I'm willing to leave that behind. And I'm willing for at least a moment in time, step fully into your truth, step fully into what life looks like in your reality, and potentially knowing what makes it that way. And from there, starting to sort of shape something new together, and yet holding on to the truth of my experience. Because if I have to give myself up and give up my experience in the process, I don't see that as radical empathy. I see that as appeasement. And for me, that's a big difference.
Right. Or subjugation, or yeah, any of those words. Okay, so let's let listeners and viewers watch, and we'll be right back.
Welcome to How We Make Peace. A Muslim and a Jew demonstrate radical empathy. I am one of your hosts, Andy Swindler, and I'm joined by my wife and co-host Rachel Zargo, and by Kawtar El Alaoui and David Sauvage, my dear friends who are Muslim and Jewish respectively, and who felt compelled at my invitation to create a space of emergence to explore an alternative to war and hate.
We need to recognize that both identities hold deep trauma and pain, both of which needs to be given voice if we are to find our way out of the grips of this war and back to sanity and humanity.
We are moving toward what's uncomfortable, not away from it, up to our capacity to hold it.
David and I have developed the ability to hold what we see as opposite truths, but with deep care.
I would like all the comfort of Israel without any of the moral reckoning. Please. Can I just get that? Says this cold, numb energy part. And now I'm feeling warm and faintly nauseous.
Mm.
And I'm seeing these horrible images that I've seen of Gaza flooding my brain. It's like a can't, like actually can't hold it, can't face it.
I'm hearing the dual experience of seeing and not wanting to see. Seeing
That's where I'm at. I'm
right.
seeing and not wanting to see.
Well, let's acknowledge that even the parts that doesn't want to see is probably trying to serve some purpose for you.
I feel uh, trapped, like I'm abandoning myself, or like I'm being abandoned, or like I'm giving space to the other side.
Look at me, David. I am the other side.
It's like I'm hearing anti-Semitic chants. So hard to dig this shit up. Oh man, it's so hard to dig this shit up.
Yeah, I can relate to that. To me, it feels like you just want to continuously run away and there is nowhere to go.
Or worse, I just want to plant my flag and be like, this is my land. You run away now. I'm done running away.
I want to scream. I want to yell. I feel deeply, deeply rageful and angry right now. How dare you not take care of your trauma and put it on me?
What's that like for you? That I'm putting my trauma on you?
It makes everything in me that wants to be nice just feel like it's about to get hijacked. And I just want to say, whatever it's going to take, I'm going to make you hear me. I want you to see the people that are dying every day who don't deserve it. I want you to stop calling everyone a potential terrorist and a threat. I want you to stand with me when the media calls me names and projects on me that I don't have the right to speak, and that the only things that come out of me are violence. I want you to stand with me and say, no, there's a different narrative. Those of us who want to be seen as not violent, those of us who want a different way. And I touch the helplessness of holding that in my psyche and not knowing what to do about it as a Muslim.
What is the narrative you want me to work to change? Or what is the new narrative you want me to help establish with you?
Let's talk about the narrative that here we are together. Yes, the past happened and it was terrible and shitty for all of us. And generations after us are going to pay for it. But let's start with the narrative that while there may be elements in the Muslim psyche and experience that only know violence as a way to speak, there are so many of us who are willing to hold hands with you. Let's make us visible. And let's stand together instead of opposite each other all the time.
There was this numbness, and Qatar held me and guided me until what was there underneath the numbness was this split in me. On the one hand, this witness, horrified, nauseous witness, who is seeing reluctantly what is happening and the bodies sacrificed for it. And on the other side, this belligerent and injured victim of generations of anti-Semitism. And I was feeling trapped in that tension. And the other part that came right in was to acknowledge that your trauma is as real and as meaningful as mine.
But there was times where I received it, and inside of me, what was speaking was this sense of, that's too comfortable for you. I need to push you further to truly see the depth of my experience. And that's what I gave voice to. It was this sense of, I'm done making you comfortable. And it's not really fully true, but at least I reached a new level of full disclosure. I want to be clear that for me in doing this work, the reason that's important is that's what actually frees up the trapped energy. That's the shadow part. And it's giving voice to that shadow. It's developing the courage to be with that shadow, giving it voice, that then makes us come back to caring for each other.
When you start to see that side taking is part of the problem itself and doesn't resolve the underlying tensions, even in the most extreme cases. And so then you enter naturally into the place Kawtar and I are holding, which is where sides start to feel less clarifying and more confusing. And what we're really witnessing isn't sides so much as energy flows and emotions and traumas and confusion and human beings and land in a big, messy dance that our hearts are going to need to find their way out of.
And I think as a collective, we really have no choice but to develop the muscle to have those conversations. It's our only way out of this. And we cannot shift this cultural narrative without each one of you that's going to step in and support the next steps.
This work is happening in emergence. Thank you all for your heart, your presence, and participation. And please take good care of yourself.
The idea would be to connect with policymakers, to connect with media, and to connect with whatever magic wants to unfold.
I believe we have the ability within 2 generations to heal this conflict, and it starts with making this the mainstream conversation.
So, Kawtar, what was it like to have that radical empathy with David?
It was at first challenging. It was nerve-wracking, and it wasn't necessarily challenging with David. The part with David was actually the easy part, and that was mind-boggling in its own way. That, having done all this work, it really validated that once you do the work, it's the easy part that comes in. For me, what was difficult was stepping into that publicly, and stepping publicly into saying, I believe there is a different way, and I believe it looks like sitting with the person that we perceive to be the enemy in this. And to say, you know what? I think we're recreating trauma more than anything else right now. And if we're willing to look at that together, to feel into that together, we can find our way out of it.
So, what do you say to critics who don't watch the 10 minutes but hear about it and say, okay, so there's this Arab woman and this Jewish man that are going to have this radical empathy conversation about what's going on? I had a thread of, I wonder what this is all about before going in, if I'm perfectly honest. I even had a reaction to him speaking first for reasons that I can't quite pin my finger on. It might be a gender issue. I'm not sure, but so what would you say to people who come to this concept of having this conversation and saying you're giving voice to the other side, therefore you are you're betraying your community? And he would feel, I guess, the same thing from his community. So how do you feel about like the echo voices that exist out there that may want to cancel you or, say bad things about you? That's a whole other layer, I imagine.
Absolutely, it is. And I think those are 2 distinct voices, I would say, the voices of skepticism versus the voices that might just want to sort of cancel me out or cancel us out. And so to the skeptics, I would say, please keep the skepticism. I actually believe it is healthy and important to have skepticism in these conversations. And the reason for that is I think there's a lot of stuff out there that's not grounded when we're talking about concepts like radical empathy or like, things that come from higher sort of wisdom, spiritual traditions, and yet are not yet grounded enough. And so I see skepticism as very healthy. What I would say is if you're open enough to the possibility of something different, experience it. Try it on for real. Suspend your judgments. Get to a place where you're willing to try it on. Be confronted with how difficult it is. and work on yourself to be able to do it. And if you don't want to, that's okay. I mean, I believe in free will. If you're not in a place where you don't want to or you don't have the capacity for it, that's okay too.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and for the voices that would want to sort of cancel it out, I think that when we have a strong reaction to something, it's actually just awakening us to something that's inside of ourselves.
Mm.
And so, for one thing, I would say, I mean, if that's really what you want to do, just cancel it out. Again, please feel free to do so. I am by no means trying to force my worldview on anybody. What I am trying to do, however, is to offer an opportunity for healing for those who are willing and able to step into it.
And so, as one of the protagonists in this experience, which you do publicly, right? There was 100 people in the room. I think that's an incredible. It transcends art. It is a healing. I don't even know what you would describe that experience as. How was it for you to feel David's radical empathy? And how was it for you to hold radical empathy for him?
That part I would say was healing. It was really healing. I've done this work in many, many different contexts, but never in this specific context, obviously. And to be able to drop into the truth of my experience as a Muslim witnessing this war, and the truth of his experience as a Jew, also witnessing this war, and recognizing also sort of the privilege that we hold being in the West. We're somewhat removed from the actual conflict, and yet we both hold it in our identities in different ways. That was really healing. It freed up something inside of me, and being able to receive all of the truth of the trauma that he would hold in his identity, and for him to be able to hear also about the power dynamics that are happening. I think that really allows something inside of all of us to be given voice when we witness that, when we sit with that.
Mm-hmm.
And then it just sort of frees up that energy that's stuck in our own bodies and the trauma of it.
Yeah, and I think what I found most compelling is that you can't, I mean, there's great actresses, Meryl Streep, we know that she's acting, and yet she moves us to believe so much in her character. That's what good acting is. But in this case, if you really sat listening to the 10 minutes, you can only hear the ring of truth. You can only hear the ring of truth. And there is something extremely powerful when you bear witness to that.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Anita. Absolutely. And I would say that's been our experience as well. And to have people who were witnesses, and we've said being a witness is an active role in this experiment.
Mm.
And to have witnesses come back to us with their feedback. Like when we started, we literally were planning to do one call.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's because of the feedback that we did the second one, and again the third one. And then we were invited to New York to speak about our experiment, and we're going to continue speaking about it and sharing. But the role of the witnesses has been to show us the power, to mirror to us the power of this work, and also the healing that's occurring within them as they listen to the conversations, as they come back to us sometimes and share what their experiences have been. And I think because we're all interconnected, it's impossible to deny that there is a symbiotic process that happens both for the audience and for us, and we can't not impact each other in that moment of deep attunement to the truth that our bodies are speaking.
And it is a master class at what those tools of nonviolent communication, radical empathy can provide and foster, right? Which is why I think, you and David are really well positioned to lead people into a new way of experiencing dialogue and conversation, right? And how that can change dynamics. And if this could be brought into organizations and in education, how powerful that would be at a certainly at a collective level. What I'm taken by is, I always invite guests to share in advance, what they hope listeners or viewers will take away. And I'm going to read back some of what you wrote because I think it's so powerful. You say empathy is not a luxury. It is a necessity to ignite cultural transformation and tackle the real challenges of our world. I completely agree. And then you say unprocessed collective trauma is one of the main causes of our lack of empathy. And that's what I'm coming to learn a little bit more of. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that. This idea of unprocessed collective trauma, which does not mean we're freaking snowflakes, just like, oh, ouch, ouch, ouch. It is real. It is, and I think so much of it is because we're still dominated by this way of thinking that's, Cartesian, linear, like, mind over matter, our emotions have to be suppressed, all of that nonsense and junk, which is why there are so many dysfunctional habits that we all have. Eating too much, having too much sex, scrolling too much. It all is because of that unprocessed trauma. We'll talk about that. And then you say it is urgent to equip today's leaders with the embodied practices of empathy and trauma release for themselves and right brain skills, which is what we're getting at. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
tell me more about this. I want to hear from your words some more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I've had the unique opportunity of doing DEI work in a global context. When I learned about DEI work, in fact, I was living in South Korea, working in India, and, Canadian, Moroccan with all my baggage and my background. And I think what that did for me is I saw the commonalities that we all carry because of our cultural narratives and baggage and how they are stored in our bodies. And that's what I've come to see as collective trauma. And when we add to that shared experiences because of our identities of past wars, and epigenetics, and how we now know that we actually carry the trauma of our grandparents and great grandparents in our own bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And I have had a deep journey of trauma release myself for about 15 years, and I've tried just about every modality under the sun for that. And so it's been I would say, a very wise teacher for me. Trauma has been a very wise teacher, a cruel one at times, but a wise one. And what I've come to see is that there is so much, those beliefs that you were talking about, right? The impact of things like systems like patriarchy, like unconscious capitalism, and even at times our religious beliefs that are not in harmony with our spirit. All of that has created so much trauma that we're not allowed to talk about. We're not even given permission to name it and to recognize that it's trauma because it's so normalized, because we're told, like, you still have to get up and go to work and be productive. And so, what I've seen though is that the more that leaders start to drop into that experience, start to recognize that, oh, this addiction that I have to overeating, this addiction that I have to too much sex, this addiction that I have to so many things, even to working out sometimes, right? First of all, naming that it's an addiction, starting to see what's driving it. What need am I trying to fill with this? What is the unmet need? It just starts to liberate again that energy and starts, at first it brings online the trauma, and so it's very difficult to hold. It can be difficult to process, but when we have the skills and we give ourselves the space to rest, the space to process, the space to meet ourselves and give ourselves compassion for that trauma and give compassion to each other, it again just completely changes the way that we are. And when leaders have the ability to do that, it inevitably translates into their ability to do it for their teams and their constituencies.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it's so important that leaders awaken to their stored trauma, because until they've met their stored trauma, they're never going to have the compassion for others.
Totally. And the same thing goes for parents, community leaders, neighbors, all of us. I'm becoming more and more interested in the inner development goals framework. I don't know if you're familiar with the IDGs, and I'm on a personal journey, and that's why I've loved your book, to not just theoretically understand how important empathy is to our workplaces, our leaders, the world, but to embody and to test out and to work out with these modalities that you've talked about, the inner work that I need to do as well to live that quality of empathy. because it's different. And so I wonder if you could share some of the practices or the modalities of healing that you find useful. We can include some information in the show notes for people who are listening and like want to lean into that.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the really, really helpful modalities was somatic experiencing.
Mm.
And it's based on the work of Peter Levine and, his book, Waking the Tiger. And just that developing that ability to meet the trauma response in my body and to not necessarily give it a story, although sometimes it helps, but to just be with it and stay with it long enough until it releases.
Mm.
I think that's a really powerful practice. Um, a more generic practice is just meditation to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
It is so powerful to begin with meditation to build that inner witness and start to recognize that I am not the trauma, become the observer to the trauma response.
Right.
I think is extremely powerful. For me personally, energy work has been really helpful as well. Things like Reiki, there are so many modalities that I remember when I began Reiki many, many years ago. It was a colleague that told me about it. And of course, my first response as a skeptic, as somebody who's trained in law, was like, what is this woo woo stuff? Like, you're going to tell me people are going to put their hands on my body and I'm supposed to feel better? But I had so much anxiety. I was willing to try anything.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would go to this healer and, she would do Reiki on me. And for the next 5 days, my husband and I would both observe the change, the shift as I would go back to anxiety sort of, taking over again. And my nervous system was so shot at the time that even a cup of coffee would start to make me shake visibly.
Mm.
And so it was this place of like, the evidence was so clear and overwhelming that I couldn't deny it.
Mm.
So I think opening ourselves up as well to these healing modalities that go beyond the mind. And luckily today science is really meeting all of these modalities and ancient wisdom is really coming together with science. So I think we just really need to drop all that skepticism in a way, or at least meet it. Dropping it might be the next step, meeting it at first and saying, you know what? Yeah, I have the skepticism, but let me give myself permission to try and make an opinion on the other side of it.
Yeah, especially in light of the fact that doing this work and healing is, while painful, the result is a happier, healthier life. So the
Absolutely.
invitation is really big and the promise is really big, but you cannot do this work and not come out the other side happier or healthier.
Absolutely. I haven't yet seen someone who's done this work and not come out the other side happier and or healthier. Absolutely. Um, and I would say personally, I think one of the biggest rewards of this work has been that my daughter, I carried a lot of anxiety for, her life, for what some of the early experiences that she and I have been through were going to do to her future. And just a few months ago, she recognized, I think, the impact of the trauma, and she said to me, Mom, I'm so grateful for all the work that you've done because you've literally interrupted the patterns of generational trauma on both sides of the family for me.
Mm.
And to hear her be able to say that and be able to name, places where, yes, there is still some impact. It's not like it's all gone, but she has the tools. She's on her own healing journey. And to see, what it does to the next generation when we step into that healing and we find the courage, because it takes courage to heal. It takes a lot of courage to go against the dominant narrative of productivity, of status, of wealth accumulation, constant wealth accumulation, and to say, you know what, maybe health is wealth.
Mm. Yes. Wow. How much self-awareness that she had to say that. And I'm so happy that you could savor that moment. Wow, that is powerful. I'm sure that's going to stay with you for a lifetime.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, my entire life changed the way I looked at her, and she was 2 years old, and I kind of saw the future that she would have had I stayed in the same life that I was in. And I had this moment, this epiphany of thinking to myself, why am I accepting things for myself that I would never accept for her?
Mm.
And that was my trigger moment to start to really open up to doing things differently.
Yeah. And we can be that. We all say we want our kids to be happy. We just want them to be happy, right? And healthy and happy. And it turns out that parents have a great responsibility that if they heal themselves, guess what will happen? Your children will be healthier and happier, right? So it's just
Absolutely.
like this, keeps giving. It's the gift that keeps giving. If only we have the courage to just go there, right?
Absolutely.
But tools now exist, as you have said. And I'll hold up this book again for those who are listening. It's Unfolding Peace, 9 Leadership Principles to Create Cultures of Well-Being, Belonging, and Peace. You write in your book that we can only create peace when we awaken to the reality of interdependence. How did you realize this, and how has it paved the way for your project on radical empathy with David?
Well, it was hard to realize. Interdependence has been one of those things that I really tried to push away. As a trauma response, in fact, I really tried to be hyper independent. And one place where it showed up was my marriage, my current marriage. And I remember I was in therapy and I was doing everything I could to push away the interdependence part of what I was processing, what I was going through. And I was so adamant that I had to find a way to make it through life on my own. And that, having uh, a marriage was supposed to be optional. And my therapist would just look at me and be like, where do you think that's going to take you? Like, how sustainable do you really see that? And then I started to also recognize that, and that was a mic drop moment for me of like, oh, so what's the alternative? Right. And I started to think about it and I found the only alternative is healthy interdependence. There's no way that I can, even with all my will, go through life on my own, sheltered from everyone. It's impossible. And as much as it was a deeply ingrained trauma response, I kind of came into the conclusion of how ridiculous it actually was. And then when I started my journey across cultures and starting to see just how connected we are, how below all the differences that we have, the similarities are so much stronger and how we need each other. And we think of, during the times of COVID, I think seeing the supply chain problems can really show us visibly how interdependent we are.
Mm.
Right? It's just absolutely inevitable that we impact each other and we need each other. And science has been able now to prove that we are interconnected. So there is no way that we're going to be able to create a world where we exist independently of the other. I think our only choice is to find ways to meet each other or to continue to perpetuate the conflicts that we're living with.
And what you are saying makes me think. I just recently watched Ava DuVernay's film Origin, which is based on the book Caste. I don't know if you've seen it.
Haven't yet.
Well, I
No,
think you would
I
love
will.
it. And I'll include this in the show notes for people who haven't watched it yet. But the book basically says beyond race, the issue is that there's caste and power. So I think that there's not only the invitation for the inner work that we need to do, but then also the intellectual rigor around just what power looks like and systemic oppression looks like across the world, and how we can decide to dismantle that and walk away from that. We don't have to be that way. And I think the inner work provides a lens to say, oh, well, of course we want to get to that, because we are all the same. We are all one. And right now we're in a system that keeps us separate. Social media, algorithms, the consumer culture that we live in, what social media is doing to our need to, regulate ourselves according to all sorts of crazy social norms, layer after layer after layer. And then, of course, the geopolitics of things. But I think that's the work. I think that's the work ahead of us as humanity. Inner work for outer change.
Absolutely. I think that's the only way that we'll have a different world. And, what I've found also the mirror between the inner work and the outer work is in a way perfect, because whenever we're resisting someone outside of us, what we're really resisting is the part of them that is inside of us.
Mm.
And so when I go inside of myself and meet that bias that I have about the other and question myself about that bias and release that bias, what's happening is that I can meet the other and I can also meet myself with equal compassion, with equal care. And I really believe, in my book, I talk about how my belief is that the purpose of conflict is to teach us to hold opposite needs with equal care.
Mm.
And we haven't been taught that. We have been taught that as soon as we feel a conflict trigger inside of us, we have to project it onto the other and they become the problem. Um, and that's kind of what's paved the way really for my work with David as well. It's one of the experiences I've rarely ever spoken about is at the age of 12, I was in Montreal walking in a Jewish neighborhood, I think on a Friday evening. And I noticed the lights were off a lot. I didn't know at the time about Sabbath. And I asked my brother, and he said, well, yeah, Jewish people have the lights off on Friday evening. He explained to me what it was. And I said to him, oh my God, imagine all this work. And then, you know, imagine like someone does all this work and then they go to God and he says, well, I didn't ask you to do that. And immediately, Anita, something inside of me clicked and I said, well, how do I know that to be true? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he'll tell me I didn't ask you to do everything that you did as a Muslim. And it was just this moment of like, how can any one of us claim to know the absolute truth?
Mm.
Right? And there's something that shifted inside of me around that and looking at the cultural beliefs that we hold about each other and how they perpetuate that separation. And we're the ones bringing them into the power dynamics,
Yeah.
right? We're the one bringing them into the system. We created the system. It didn't create itself.
Yeah.
And so we start to look at that within ourselves and say, well, if I truly believe in a world where everybody is equal, then where am I not upholding that world within myself? And there are so many ways that we do that. Bias is so deeply ingrained into our psyche. And then when we add bias with power, of course, then it creates some of the disconnects that we have, especially in our Western societies. We have the courage and we're beginning to name it, we're beginning to speak about it. And I think if we can develop the comfort and the courage to meet it together, beyond that discomfort and that shame and blame, I think that's when we really create something transformative with each other.
And I think, on the precipice of global ecological collapse, right? We're so near that. What can we do? This is what we can do. This is what we can do. This is what I think we owe our progeny, the generations to follow. This is like a last moment for us to do something. This inner work is necessary. It's not woo-woo. It is necessary.
Absolutely, absolutely. And one way that I really see that time and again is that whenever we connect with our real needs, from nonviolent communication, we all have, well, I think a lot of people know the list of real needs. Whenever we connect with our real needs, our consumption habits change.
Mhm.
And I see that time and again.
Yeah.
We start to need to be in nature more. We no longer need the artificial entertainment as much. And we don't need to buy so many things.
Yeah.
It's just incredible how it works. And yet all we've done is release the places again within ourselves where we were hooked, to distractions. We were hooked to all of these, what's the word I'm looking for? I forgot the word. We just said it earlier.
Distractions.
um,
It's okay. We can edit
Addictions.
this. Addictions.
Yeah, addictions.
Yeah, there's a practice that we have in one of my classes called the public narrative. It comes from Marshall Ganz's work at the Kennedy School, and it's essentially a leadership tool of storytelling about the self and the us and the now. And with a class of 45 students, it could go well over 3 hours for every student to give a 2 to 3 minute public narrative. And I tell my students going in, I said, this is the class that's going to change the semester. And this might be the class that you'll remember of your entire undergrad. And they're all kind of rolling their eyes. And I said, and plus we might go 4 hours. And next week we'll take 2 hours for class. And they're freaking out like, oh gosh. But the invitation is, if you show up and you are courageous and vulnerable without oversharing, because we don't want that. But if you're courageous and vulnerable in sharing your story, and everybody does, we're going to have something amazing happen. And it has never failed. It has always lived up to the hype and then some. And then half the class goes out and has more time together. And the reason why I share this story, given what you just shared, is that it is meeting the need of belonging and connection, which in a world that is so uber connected, apparently through technology, people are seen and heard. And I think that's a core need that we have, is to be seen and heard and to feel that connection. And so we have to have more time for doing things like that. And that's why your work is so important. I can't believe we're coming to the end of this podcast, Kawtar. You've been an incredible guest, and I'm so grateful for your time. I always end the conversation with the same question, and that is, if you can think of a time in your life when you were on the receiving end of empathy and what it meant for you.
Absolutely. There is this one story when I started coaching, when I started coach training. One of the very first days, they asked us to do an exercise. And I remember one of the faculty, who became a mentor and now is a dear friend, asked me at the end of it, "How are you feeling?" And I was feeling really raw. And I just said to him, I feel naked. It feels really vulnerable right now. And he just said to me, "I get it, but naked with dignity."
Oh.
And
Oh.
it was so powerful. You
That
can see how
is.
he became a dear friend.
Yeah. Wow. Wow.
Yeah. And I think if we can extend that to each other, that ability to allow each other to come apart and be so raw and authentic in our experience, and yet give each other grace and dignity in the process. Because we have to do that for ourselves first to be able to do that for the other, we will literally transform human dynamics in this world.
What an incredibly powerful story. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you, Anita. Thank you for having me. It's been wonderful speaking with you.
Thank you. And I thank everyone for watching and listening. We'll see you next week at Purposeful Empathy. Thanks so much for watching another episode of Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. So now the invitation is to subscribe to the channel and consider picking up a copy of Purposeful Empathy. Thanks again for watching. Have a great day.